Hi, everyone. Welcome to the special edition of Research and Beyond, an interactive podcast series that explores latest advances in STEM. Now, this podcast is extra special because we're celebrating Open Access Week 2024 with a focus on the recurring theme community over commercialization. This is Anupama Kapadia, your host for the day. And today we have with us Matthew Byers, the Executive Director of DataCite, a board member of Center for Open Science, Force 11, and Vice Chair of DOI. He's been an integral part of various other global associations, including ORSCID, Thomson Reuters, and EBSCO Information Services. With over a decade in the publishing industry, Matthew brings with him unique insights coupled with actionable recommendations for our listeners. I'm sure this will be a very interesting and informative session. We're so happy for you to join us, Matthew. Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. So let's begin, because our listeners are already tuned in. Let's begin with your perspectives of open science and accessibility. As mentioned a few minutes ago, you've held various influential roles in organizations like Force 11, Center for Open Science, and DataCite. Now, I want to know, how has your journey so far shaped your perspective on the evolution of open science, open access, and open data? And has this open access movement transformed in the ways that you have expected?
So I guess to not give a direct answer, I will start with yes and no. So yes, I think there has been progress, and that's good for the community. I think that we see change happening is really important. But I think we still face a lot of challenges, particularly around global equity. And I think that's something that we need to think about when we think about open science. It has no borders, and we need to think about this from a global perspective. And so there's still challenges there. When I think about the open science movement, we think about culture change and the change of the way we've done things. And so in order to bring that true change in making that normative globally, we need to not only make it easy and possible to practice open science, but also we need to make sure that the right incentives are there for researchers to truly practice open science. And I think we've seen change and movements and lots of policy coming out in various countries, various regions. But I'm still missing in many cases where there's a true incentive for researchers to fully embrace open science. And so that's something that I think is still coming. I would like to say that I'm positive. I think there's a lot of groundswell and movement. So that's good. And I think that the future looks positive.
Yes, so that definitely sounds promising. And thanks for highlighting the need, for the improvement in the overall open access movement. So going on to the next question, with your experience in Force 11 and Center for Open Science, how important do you think is collaboration between different open infrastructure organizations? You just mentioned, it involves different regions, underserved regions primarily, and equity. But is there any risk of fragmentation or duplication of efforts? If so, what are they and how can they be avoided?
Yeah, I think absolutely. It's a constant challenge. We all know the story around standards and the proliferation of standards. Oh, this standard doesn't quite meet my needs, so I'm going to create a new standard. And then the same applies here, is that we across regions build different technical silos, different communities, and we need to make sure that we always keep this in mind. There is, on a technical level, good interoperability frameworks that we can look at in open scholarly infrastructure that can help, but also in services, in how do we collaborate. I think open metadata is really important in ensuring that we can forward the open science movement. But we also need to extend beyond just saying that we are interoperable with other schemas or other standards. It really needs to be a true democratization of open science. And this is, I think, in line with the theme is that community over commercialization, is that how do we ensure that we are building this as a community and as a community of communities, because there's also different perspectives and different challenges across communities that need to be understood. And so whilst I don't provide a concrete answer to that, I think just to reiterate that there is fragmentation, there is duplication of efforts, and the only way we can avoid that is talking to each other. And we try and adopt that very much. If I look at my role at DataCite, is that we don't see DataCite as being the only open infrastructure. It's really important that we work with other infrastructure and create that interoperability and flow of information for the betterment of the global community and open science.
Yes, absolutely. And I think Europe as a region has probably taken good steps towards this, because now they have a European Open Science Cloud initiative. But like you mentioned, global alignment, I think achieving that is still challenging because of regional interests and regional gaps. So now, speaking of inclusivity, as we talk about open science, the growing concern is how commercialization might inadvertently exclude smaller or underfunded institutions from participating fully in the global research ecosystem, right? So what do you think? How can we ensure that the open scholarly infrastructure, it remains truly accessible to everyone without be dominating by commercial interests, particularly for researchers and institutions from underrepresented or resource-constrained regions? So what are your thoughts about this?
I think this is a fundamental challenge that we face, and one that we haven't solved as a community. There is a cost to doing these things, but there's also equally innovative, creative ways that we can fund and sustain these efforts. I think that we often forget and we pretend to understand challenges across regions. And so whilst I was born in South Africa, grew up in South Africa, spent most of my life there, South Africa is also different from other countries in Africa. And so I cannot pretend that I fully understand the challenges in the different countries, different regions. And the only way that we can fully tackle equity issues is through collaboration and inclusive governance of the efforts that we're doing. And so that's really important in when we setting up services, when we're setting up community governed organizations, that there is true inclusivity and representation across the regions, so that we can protect that true global inclusivity value that we all talk about. And that's really, really key. I think that there's nuanced challenges, and so we also need to be creative in the ways that we're looking to solve these things. And so I look at examples of persistent identifier metadata and registration at DataCite is that that's one aspect, but not the full challenge. And so I have worked with many communities where there's challenges around setting up servers and technical staff to maintain those servers and the cost associated with that, and the funding being available this year, but not next year. And so how do we address these? We need to be creative and think inclusively across the global community. Everyone that I talk to is really keen on global inclusivity, but I think it's really getting down to the specific challenges and building partnerships and collaborations that is going to open that. Fundamentally, we need to make sure that we always protect that any researcher anywhere in the world can practice open science in the sense that they can make their research outputs and resources openly available and discoverable and citable without any cost and very limited technical needs or barriers, in the sense that they can deposit things in platforms that suit their needs, that fit within their domain. That's something that's a key thing that we need to make sure that we protect and make sure it is available to the global community. There's still always going to be the challenge of that commercialization, but I think we need to just continue to think about that. The other thing that I'll say is that I mentioned it earlier, is that the incentives need to change, in that if we want to ensure that there's inclusivity, and I use one example, we have lots of malaria research being done in, say, Africa as an example. And the research data is produced by researchers in Africa, but they may not necessarily be involved in the journal article and publishing that journal article. And so they lose the credit, and that's where the incentive is placed. As a global community, we place so much incentive on solely the journal article. And so when it comes to funding and credit for furthering the research, we need to ensure that there's also incentive and credit across the entirety of the research lifecycle. So open science not just being a single output or resource, but the entirety of the research lifecycle. And so making sure that globally we're creating incentives for that change, and those incentives are inclusive in that context as well.
Yeah, that's so interesting. The example that you mentioned, I was not aware that this happens, but it's good to know. And I think we have evidence that studies do show that equitable research or equitable access to research, open research, could dramatically improve academic outcomes even in developing countries such as Africa. So
absolutely, and I just wanted to add there, I wanted to make sure that I'm clear that I don't want to say that there's researchers that come in to collect data in Africa and then they have perverse incentives or bad intentions around publishing the article, but that's just the reality of they then take that data and they then go and produce an article or do further work on that data, and so I'm not saying that they're doing anything. It's just the incentives around that, if that makes sense. I just wanted to not criticize.
No. Yeah, yes. So that's an interesting insight. And of course, one of the more actionable comments that we've received so far. But speaking of metadata, because you mentioned this, quite a couple of times now. So metadata, as we know, is of course important for making research outputs discoverable, right? How do you envision the role of technology, especially digital identifiers, in making these research outputs more discoverable and accessible to a global audience, including underrepresented regions? So what are your thoughts on this?
So I am somewhat biased coming from a organization that really focuses on persistent identifiers and metadata and spent a long time in this area, but it's absolutely integral. I don't pretend that it's everything that we need to focus on, but it is a very integral component of what we're doing. Metadata describes the research output or resource, and I intentionally use output and resource because it could be from a data set to an article, from a preprint to a physical sample or a specimen. These are all part of the research lifecycle. We could even include data management plans in this, and these are all contributions and activities that happen within the research lifecycle. And so metadata, persistent identifiers help us in understanding this, and we help connect and understand the different activities that are happening through these relationships between these things. And that's something that we talk about at DataCite, is connecting research, advancing knowledge. And what we mean by that is, how do we bring together the disparate pieces of the research lifecycle? So all of these contributions that researchers have in the research group, because it's not a researcher, it's a group of researchers. How do we bring that together and make that openly available so different systems, services, and discovery layers that build on top of digital identifiers and metadata can use that to further the advancements of discovery? And ultimately, what we want to see is that we see cross-discipline use of different research outputs and resources, cross-border use of different outputs and resources to further science and advance society ultimately. And that's what we exist to do, is that we want to better society in that the research really has a tangible impact for us in our daily lives and the global lives of society.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Can you give us an example of how these, from a data set point of view also, how researchers' practices while using the metadata influences, particularly in relation to how they manage the data, share the data, use the data ethically and with quality? So can you shed a little bit more light on this?
Yeah, so the way I really talk about this is that I almost don't want researchers to worry too much about persistent identifiers and metadata. Essentially, it sounds strange saying that, but really researchers want to do research. And we want them to do research because that's what they do. And so when we talk about this, we think about this as open infrastructure. And infrastructure is something that should be, if we're talking about it a lot or we're complaining about it or it's creating challenges, it means that the infrastructure is not working. And so we need to make sure that this infrastructure is built into the workflows and the services that researchers use. And that's really important. We launched a project last year that worked with a group of researchers from the start of the research study to right through to actually publishing an article and understanding what are the different workflows you go to and how do we make sure that the open infrastructure, and this was specifically from the persistent identifier and metadata point of view, but how do we make sure that we are building the infrastructure around the services that you use? And so this is the same for organizations like ORCID, is that how do we simplify and make it easy for researchers to benefit from these different, from the open infrastructure and the services. And so if we get that right, then researchers can go to a discovery tool and try, they can search for certain areas, they can identify collaborations, they can track impact, but it's all within the context of what they're used to. And so that's really important when we think about infrastructure, is that we shouldn't be creating more of a burden. We often get into, oh, this works, but only if the researcher goes and does this, they need to deposit this output here, and then they need to go and add this metadata, and then they need to link it to this. That's too much, and that doesn't scale and bring the true benefits that we're looking to achieve as a global community. And so it's really important that infrastructure, we make it one, possible, but we make it really easy to do. And so if I bring back that culture change that I mentioned earlier, is that if we make it possible and easy from an infrastructure point of view, and that universities, funders, governments are able to make it required and rewarding to do this, then we achieve this change that we are looking for.
That's brilliant. In your experience, again, have you received concerns about data privacy though?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's a growing concern. Obviously, when we think about metadata is generally facts. I think there's workflows, and I've seen in different contexts where there's sensitive data. When we look at one example, brain imaging data, this under GDPR in Europe is considered personally identifiable data, and so it can't be openly available. But we can register persistent identifiers and have metadata about the data and have a brokered access process so that somebody could go through a process to access that data. And so I think, again, it's building those, making sure as a global community that we need to build those services to address these challenges that we see. And this is a region-specific challenge. There's other examples of that in other regions, but this is one that came across under GDPR within Europe. And so it's really important that we working together on that. And this is just a perfect example of that. We cannot think about any single stakeholder or group addressing everything. It's this ecosystem view that we need to take, is how do we work together to address these?
Absolutely. Can you share an example of where maybe a strong governance or a strong policy has made a critical difference, in open science and open access? Is there an example that you can think of? I think our audience will be able to relate to something like this.
Yes, I think that seeing some of the national mandates in different regions, one example, the Nelson Memo, which hasn't fully come into effect, but that's a step in the right direction. I think, again, we need to make sure that the incentives are there. And so there's good policies out there. I think over the last 3 years, we've seen really, really good what I would say almost transformative policies, but it's at this tipping point of seeing that actually in reality. And I think it's that incentive that is still lacking. If I ask a researcher, just focusing on data as an example, if I ask a researcher, what incentive do you have to make your research data openly available and citable? In many cases, I will get the answer that there is no incentive. I'm not saying that it's not across the board, but generally speaking, and I think that's the change that we need to see, is that, okay, in my tenure and promotion, data is something that is recognized. And so I know this from, as an example, Northwestern in the US, they've brought this into some of their tenure and promotion committees where they actually consider data as an output and something that's really important in the tenure and promotion review. And so when we see more of these, and sorry, I've focused now on two US examples. I think it's important that we, bring these incentives globally, and everyone can talk about good examples of this.
Sure. So coming to maybe, talking about commercialization a little bit, how do you balance the need for innovation and revenue growth with, the entire ethos of open science? For example, how does your commitment to the principles of open scholarly infrastructure, how does this influence the revenue growth objective that you might have?
So fundamentally, we focus in the principles of open scholarly infrastructure around sustainability. And so there's a cost, as I mentioned earlier, to running services infrastructure. Sometimes I think we get caught up in trying to compare one infrastructure with another, and there's different ways to do things. Some have a more centralized model where technology and the services are maintained centrally. In other cases, it's a more open source contribution with developers around the world contributing. There's a cost associated with all of these. So really what is key here is understand what are the cost drivers and what is the base resource cost of sustaining these, and making sure that you have a sustainability model that addresses that. And there's no right or wrong sustainability model. There's different approaches, but really making sure that there is a model that is there that also scales over time, because costs will go up over time, and that model needs to scale. And so we've done that, with my experience at ORCID, we've also done this at DataCite, really looked at, well, what is the resource cost and how do we sustain that? The other piece here that is really important is that no data, fundamentally, this is a principle that we believe in, and it's core to what we do across the different organizations I'm involved in, is that the data should not be the thing that is locked in that you have to pay to access. That's all open. It's really about the value add services that is providing value to the community that may have a fee associated with that. Again, we want to break down in certain regions, reducing that barrier and having no fee, but the data should be openly available. And then having that ultimate insurance, making sure that your codes, as an example, at DataCite, our entire code base is MIT open source, and our entire data file is CC0. And that's the ultimate insurance, is that somebody could set up DataCite tomorrow, essentially. But the value in DataCite and these community-governed organizations is a social construct that we have globally working together around the common challenges. And so whilst the technology and the data can be set up, the value for us is really collaborating as a global community and all working around this common challenge. That's where the value is. And so it's really important when we think about sustainability as well, is building these insurance mechanisms. So if there is this risk of commercialization in line with the theme, we do have open data and open code that, the community has that insurance in place. And the community could shift to focusing around another initiative if needed. So that's really important.
Absolutely. Now coming to a few personal questions. Looking back in your career, right? Can you describe a turning point where a particular challenge or an initiative reshaped your approach to open science and metadata? Like, how has that influenced your current work and your current leadership in this area?
I think the linking back to global equity and the communities of practice, in that every community is different, and that we have different challenges, different drivers for incentives, and that the approach needs to be such that we understand that we are not always going to all do things exactly the same way, but how do we find that commonality in that community of practice, and how do we work together around that? And so I think that's been something in joining ORCID, really working with the global community, understanding the different regions, was something that really led me to understand more around how do we find that commonality that ORCID can serve, whilst understanding that there are specific regional, national, domain-specific things that will be addressed outside of ORCID. And so not trying to say, we know everything and we're all going to do it the same. That's not the way it works. And that's, again, with open science, is that policies in one region don't work necessarily in another region. There's very different structures and systems in place.
All right. And as someone who's deeply involved in the global conversation about open science, what advice would you personally give to early career researchers who may not, have heard about this in terms of open data sharing, or in terms of, the potential incentives or policies around it? What is your advice to them? But they are looking to contribute to this movement. They just probably don't know how. What would you tell them?
So I think I'll say that open science thrives on shared knowledge and collaborative efforts. Early career researchers, I think it's really important to make your research outputs and resources openly accessible. And so there's many different platforms out there that exist. As an example, Africa Archives, Zenodo, lots of different platforms around the world that exist to serve this need. And I've listed two. That's certainly not exhaustive. There's various national repositories, systems, catalogs of samples that exist. So make sure that your research outputs and resources are openly available, cite them and use them. The other piece is that organizations and researchers should really look to support the movement. And so from an organizational point of view, I think it's adopting best practices, but also creating and implementing the incentives, also putting in policies around licensing. Funders also are involved in this, using Creative Commons licenses that are widely understood, using things like local context for indigenous knowledge, tags or labels, as they talk about, and making sure that we also understand the reuse and the licensing and context of those, and make sure that they're widely accessible and reusable. And I think if the community in research organizations and researchers are doing that, and we're doing our job as open infrastructure, and governments and funders are creating incentives, I think this is where we really see that movement and change and advancement.
All right. I think that that certainly ended on a promising note. Do you think I've not covered any point for our audience that you would like them to know? And if yes, the screen is open for you to talk.
I think the main thing is just that we're a community, and I think it's important to have open dialogue and keep talking. We don't always agree. That's a good thing, because when we agree, it's when we're uncovering the differences and challenges that we see from different perspectives. And that's really important. So rather than building another silo or creating another effort, let's talk to each other, try work together, and build an ecosystem that is a community of communities.
All right. Thanks, Matthew. I think we couldn't have found a better speaker or an expert to talk about this other than you. That was one of the best sessions that we've ever had. And thanks a lot for collaborating with us on this podcast and sharing some really useful insights. I'm sure our viewers had a great time listening in. Thank you once again, Matthew.
Great. Thank you so much for your time and inviting me.
Thank you. And to all our listeners, thank you a lot for joining us. Stay tuned for more updates on Open Access Week celebrations within Argo Academy. Goodbye for now.